God use ghostwriters?
Did slaves write the New Testament?
What evidence do we have for the contribution of slaves to literary production?
And does Candida Moss have the answers?
Welcome to Horizons of Scripture, a biblical studies podcast with me, Elizabeth Corsar.
And me, Charlie Hadjiev. Right, Elizabeth, we are talking about who wrote the Bible, but we are going to take a different slant, and this is going to be first for us because rather than just talk generally about the topic, we will use one book, and this is the recent book by Candida Moss called God's Ghostwriters. So that book came out about a month ago or so, and you were the one who suggested we use that book even before we had read it. So why on earth did you do that?
Well, Candida Moss is well known. She's the Edward Cadbury Professor of Theology at Birmingham. She's also a regular columnist for the Daily Beast. So she's a big figure in early Christianity. And she's written broadly, she's written on martyrdom, disability, but more recently she's writing on slavery and looking at the role of enslaved persons in the composition of the Bible, and particularly the New Testament. So I thought this fitted in well with our discussion of authorship and thinking about who did, in fact, write the Bible.
Yeah, she has a very interesting thesis, doesn't she? And the book is very interesting. So it's probably fair to say we are not gonna analyze the whole book. We will focus on those aspects of it that particularly have to deal with the writing of the New Testament.
Absolutely.
She talks about slavery more generally, and there's a lot to learn there. But we'll focus on the writing.
Yeah.
And she uses. She uses that term ghostwriters. What is a ghostwriter?
What is a ghostwriter?
Well, there was a movie, The Ghostwriter, with I can't remember now, a few years back, which is where I get, I suppose, most of my ideas about what a ghostwriter is. Ewan McGregor, I think, started.
Oh, really?
Yeah. It was a good movie. I think the ghostwriter got killed in the end. Sorry to spoil it for you, but I think the ghostwriter is someone. So if you are a very rich person, or if you are a person who knows a lot about something and you want to write a book, but you don't necessarily want to spend all that time writing, or you can't be bothered, or you can't write. Then you hire someone who can write. And basically they write the book for you, but I think their name doesn't appear at all. So you take all the credit. They get paid a fee. That's the way it works. So she's used that concept.
Yes. This idea of the enslaved persons being these ghostwriters of the New Testament. But of course they weren't paid because they were enslaved.
Yes. So let's dig in. Let's start first of all with explaining maybe the historical background and helping our listeners understand what was the situation in antiquity in terms of slaves and writing, and why are we even talking about the contribution of slaves to the process of the writing of the New Testament. So, I mean, people usually say not everybody could read and write in antiquity.
Well, no, and a popular book by William Harris, he looked at ancient literacy, he claims that it was only 10% of the population who could read and write. So it is striking this idea that there were enslaved peoples as part of this percentage.
Yeah, and I mean, when you talk about read and write, there is a difference between being able to read a simple letter and being able to read the works of Homer, for example. So there are levels of literacy. So you'd think slaves wouldn't be able to read because they are enslaved, they are poor, right?
Yeah. But it seems that, and Candida informs us of this, there was children who were born into slavery, into sort of the imperial family. They were educated alongside the children of the household. they grew up receiving this education that allowed them to be competent authors. In other instances, individuals were captured in conquests, and
they were already quite highly educated.
Yeah, and brought on. So she gives us a broad picture of how these literate persons became enslaved and how they function.
So there would have been a lot of enslaved people who are highly educated, maybe sometimes even more highly educated than their masters or their enslavers, as she likes to call them.
Yes, that was really striking reading that. You don't think about it really, that a slave would be more intelligent than their master, but actually she really brought that to the fore and worked through that. So that was really interesting.
Yeah, so the first chapter, which begins with the historical background, and it is, I suppose, one example of. I thought the book was really well written.
It's beautifully written, yeah.
And one example of that, so the very first chapter called Essential Workers.
Yeah.
I wonder whether the language of the pandemic here emerges.
Perhaps, yeah.
But her very first phrase is, "Children can be cruel, they say." And then she uses this famous graffiti where you have a donkey on a cross and a person worshipping it, and there is a sign saying Alexamenos worships his god.
Yeah.
And then she builds around that this story about this little child who was a slave, and he was educated together with other slaves in the imperial family to serve eventually as secretaries. When I was reading it, I thought it is a really clever way because of getting into the topic, because she builds a very real picture of a school where there is this poor Christian boy who is being bullied by the others. And I assume many of the people who would be interested in ancient history will be at least somewhat nerdy, would you say?
Probably, yeah.
And therefore have experienced bullying at school at some stage. And at least for me, I immediately felt a connection with the topic right from the start. So it is an easy to read book.
Oh yes, no, it is.
And so why would they train these children eventually to become these highly educated enslaved people? Wouldn't it be easier, wouldn't it be better for a master, an enslaver, an aristocrat to actually do that highly intellectual work themselves?
Well, I think it's as simple as, and we know this well, it's difficult writing, and it's the sort of physicalities of it as well. In ancient society, they didn't have very ergonomic chairs and desks and laptops and the way that we had. So it was hard work. But then it even started before that with getting together the materials, the sort of parchment, the papyrus, the writing utensils that they were going to use. You know, the enslaved person would create all of that before they even then started the task of writing. And I think it was much easier for an elite individual just to dictate and for someone else to do the hard labor.
To their slaves, yeah. And she makes the good point also that they didn't have electricity. You don't have your night
exactly
light,
yeah.
And maybe some of them had problems with their eyesight, which I have 3 pairs of glasses to help me cope with life. So in the ancient world, if you didn't have that, if you had a slave, that would be pretty handy.
Yeah.
So let's talk about maybe first of all about Paul in the epistles, because I think the situation is slightly different when you move to the Gospels. But with Paul, we have quite a lot of information. So what would have been the role of slaves in the composition of the Pauline epistles?
Yeah, I mean, in the epistles, and Candida points this out, in the canonical texts that we have, Paul's co-workers are named. These individuals who appear to have been his secretaries, his scribes, are actually mentioned in the text. And I think we often, as sort of contemporary readers now, just think, oh, that was just his sort of missionary friend. But in fact, someone like Timothy may well have been an enslaved person that Paul had been given to help him. So.
Yes, we know the letter to the Romans was written by somebody else, because in chapter 16, he says, he gives his name, Tertius.
Yes,
says,
exactly.
I wrote this letter. We're not told that he's a slave, though.
No, we're not. But I think based on the evidence of what these slaves sort of, as secretaries, as scribes, and the sort of archaeology, the history of them, we can suggest that Tertius may well be a slave.
It might, yeah. Okay, so from the general historical, our knowledge of the general historical situation, it is a supposition that we might make. We know Onesimus was a slave.
Absolutely.
Now, she suggests maybe Onesimus was the person who actually wrote down the letter to Philemon.
Yeah.
We don't know that, but possibly.
Possibly, yeah. It's plausible.
It's plausible. And here we come to, I suppose we will come back to that question again in terms of the of how do we know all this and her evidence for this and how speculative this all is. But we have these bits of information. Of course, you mentioned Galatians. There is, I think, in Corinthians as well, Paul says something like, I write with my own hand.
Yes.
Which does suggest somebody else has been writing up until this point.
Exactly, yeah, that idea of him sort of just popping his signature on the end of it, yeah.
Yeah, so Paul, to have slaves, it is a little bit like maybe when we finally managed to construct the robots to do all our dirty work for us. Maybe they'll be cheap enough to afford, maybe not, we don't know. But Paul wasn't necessarily very rich, and neither were some of the other authors of the New Testament. And one wonders then, how have they been able to afford slaves?
No, absolutely. And Candida addresses this. She thinks about the historical Paul. He'd be traveling around, setting up his tent-making business, getting to know the local people, and she proposes that there would be these affluent, elite Christian patrons who would have loaned him their slaves to do the writing of the epistles.
Yeah, and she points to parallels. So Origen had a wealthy patron called Ambrose.
Yes,
and,
absolutely.
He kind of gave him a team of slaves to work on all the many books and the hexapla that he produced.
Yeah. So we've looked at these letters, and we've seen in these sort of the sign-offs to the letters that there were perhaps secretaries and slave secretaries helping Paul with these letters. But do we know of anything else, the contents of the letters that maybe give away that an enslaved person was the hand behind them?
Yes, so this is really the tricky and important bit. Now, Candida Moss says that slaves and secretaries used shorthand. So when you dictate to someone, they will jot down what you say using shorthand. And she says there were maybe about 5,000 signs. You will have to compress the speech, and then the slave will go away to the other room, and then they will expand what they have jotted down and written the letter. And so therefore, actually, the text of the letter itself came from the secretary, not so much from the original author. So some of the ideas and thoughts were obviously from Paul, but the actual text of Romans would have been written by Tertius. The problem, of course, is that we don't know how much and to what degree, because we don't have the notes, we can't read them, we don't know what happened there. All we have is the final product, where we have the name of Paul and the possible influence of the secretary. And this is where I think she enters in the realm of speculation. I mean, there's nothing else you can do really, but we have to use our imagination and our best guess to imagine what that contribution would have looked like. So she gives 5 examples, and some of them are. Yeah, I think when we start looking at the examples, this is where I'm beginning to think how much can she actually prove beyond the more general assertion. So Philippians 4, for example, 4:15, she says when Paul addresses the Philippians, he uses the Latin version of the term Philippians rather than the Greek version. Which would have been, I mean, the Philippines would have liked that because it would have reminded them of the fact that they were a Roman colony and so on. So it is a politically good move on the part of the writer. Did Paul use that term? Possibly. But she says, well, maybe Paul didn't know enough Latin or enough of the situation to do that, and therefore it was the slave, the secretary, whose job was to make Paul look better, who at this stage thought, let me just change that and make it a nicer looking address.
It's like copy editors of our books, isn't it? Go along and just make it stylistically cleaner and
and you might say in the acknowledgements, thank you very much, or you might not. And even if you do, nobody knows what exactly was changed.
No. We get this little interesting phrase in 2 Corinthians and in chapter 10, this idea of Paul being better in writing than he was in person. So this really sort of speaks into this. Is somebody else going through his work and fixing it and making it flow better.
Yeah. And I think that reference there is one piece of evidence that I find compelling, that there was some work done which improved his style, because it would be a natural explanation of why he was better at writing than he was better at speaking.
Yeah. And I think Candida introduces this idea of these enslaved secretaries, including some of their own creative ideas into the text. This idea that it's not all entirely Paul's, but actually there is another level in there.
Yes, exactly, and this is where I wonder. So she gives the example in 1 Thessalonians 5. Where Paul says, stay awake. And this would have been the slave's job, at night the slave will stay awake waiting for the master, or to keep watch or whatever. The master will not necessarily be up.
No.
And so it is a very slavish idea, which is then taken up as the ultimate example of Christian behavior.
Yes.
And therefore, maybe it came from slaves.
Yeah. And that's a really interesting point, because I think what Candida then does is when she then goes into the Gospels, that idea is continued of some of that Gospel material, where it refers to, or perhaps refers to, slaves. She asks, is this evidence of slaves being behind the text of the Gospels as well? So it is really interesting.
Yes, although, so I don't know, what did you think when you, let's imagine Paul is writing or dictating his letter. The slave jots it down in shorthand, goes away and expands it into the full text, and adds all these ideas. Would Paul not have checked?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, because you have that idea in the letters that he's sort of signing them off at the end. That sort of, he's not written them, but he's signing them off. So you would think he would have a read of them before he signed them off. So yeah, it's an interesting question as to how much were things changed. And
exactly, and this is where I think the uncertainty of her thesis come into play. I mean, for some of the letters, he was in prison, and if it was a dark hole somewhere and he couldn't see very well.
She makes quite a nice argument of this, isn't it? Like an enslaved person sort of crouching down beside a window, taking down the dictation. And yeah, Paul wouldn't have been able to see it in the prison cell afterwards because it's too dark. So yeah, she makes these, this could be the case, you know. It makes sense of the archaeology of ancient prisons that's what it would have been like. So
in some cases you might say, okay, he couldn't physically check the final version, but you'd think in some of the other cases, if he wasn't in prison, there is no reason why he wouldn't read the letter or have the letter read to him. And therefore the idea that a slave would have introduced a lot of new creative stuff seems a little bit strange to me.
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely something I hadn't thought about before, and it is really interesting. But I do want, it's almost sort of, perhaps we could see it more as redactional layers. I mean, as a Hebrew Bible scholar, you know all about this of different authors coming in at different times.
Yeah. I mean, I really liked her examples with Galatians. So in Galatians, she makes the point that there's some very clever wordplays there.
Yes, yeah. The pillars and pens.
Exactly, yes.
Yeah.
So they are pillars, stiloi, but the word can also mean a pen. Yeah. And she's saying, maybe the guy was just playing with language. And
yes, yeah. Were these sort of these upstanding members of the community, these pillars, or were they the scribes, the slaves who wrote it? So yeah.
But doesn't necessarily dramatically change any of the major rhetorical or
well, no, the theology is the same, isn't it? Like they've not, that's not been altered, but yeah.
Shall we talk about the Gospels a bit?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Paul used secretaries to write his letters.
Yeah. So who wrote the Gospels? Did the Gospel authors employ enslaved secretaries?
Yes, let's start with Mark.
Yes.
The first Gospel. So Mark, we have a 2nd century tradition that was written by Mark, who wrote down what Peter was saying.
Yeah, the interpreter of Peter, right?
Yes. And Candida Moss thinks Mark was a slave.
Yeah.
How do you feel about that?
I think what fascinated me with this was, and that idea that I brought up in relation to Paul's letters of these enslaved persons bringing their own ideas to the text. So there's this idea of, in the Gospels, Jesus is, especially Mark's Gospel, he's presented like a slave from the very beginning because he doesn't have a human father, and at the end he's crucified on a Roman cross, the death of a slave. So the sort of Jesus's entire life in Mark's Gospel seems to be that of a slave, and we just when I'm teaching Christology classes, we say, this is Mark's Christology, this servant king idea in Mark's Gospel. But it's fascinating, Candida, reading it through this lens. Actually, we get this sort of backstory to it, and like, oh gosh, why is the theology the way it is? So that was really eye-opening.
Yes, you're right, and I think one of the good aspects of the book is emphasizing the structures of slavery and how those structures are used to portray theological ideas and notions. To describe Jesus, she later on talks about slavery being used as the concept that describes the Christian identity itself.
Yes,
or a slave to God.
Absolutely, yeah.
My question, and she does say Mark, or whoever wrote Mark's Gospel, is quite likely a Jewish slave who was trafficked after the fall of Jerusalem to Rome. And I wonder, so how, if you think about the 30, 40 odd years that elapsed between the writing of the Gospel and the events of the life of Jesus, are we to imagine that the slave or Mark came and just wrote everything and imposed on the material all these new notions that have to do with slavery? Or was that enough in the oral tradition that came to him or her?
Yes.
That was already there. In other words, there was already a deeply embedded notion in the tradition that this is how Jesus was. Obviously, crucifixion was a slave's death.
Exactly, yeah.
And so it was more, it resonated with the enslaved experience, but wasn't necessarily a contribution of the enslaved authors of the New Testament.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. I think, as you say, we know historically that Jesus was crucified. We know that that was the death penalty for slaves, for robbers, political agitators. But it is that question of did that understanding of Jesus as a slave come from those earliest followers of Jesus? Was that how they were interpreting him? And did that come up through the oral tradition to the author of the gospel? Or is it a notion that the author of the gospel and subsequent enslaved secretary have imposed on it? And I think the reality is we don't know. We know that Jesus lived and died, but what he actually did during that time it's uncertain. So we are sort of left with unrecoverable sources, but what we have is the written text.
And the problem is that the oral tradition leading up to the gospel is unrecoverable.
Yeah.
There weren't people with their iPhones going around recording what was going on.
Yeah,
so
they
we
weren't there at the crucifixion filming it.
Exactly. So it is. We have to speculate, but we also have to speculate if we want to see those invisible people who contributed to the writing of the New Testament text. So you have one speculation over against another, and I think we just have to be clear about the fact that it is an interesting thesis, and it illuminates quite a lot of the text, but it is ultimately as speculative as some of the other stuff which has gone before.
Yeah, no, that's fair.
But it does produce some very interesting exegetical results. Let's talk a bit about the paralytic.
Yes. This was really interesting. Her dealing with the paralytic. Yeah, we just read it as a story about Jesus' power. You know, when he says to the paralytic, you know, take up your mat and walk. We're not thinking that it's got anything to do with the men who brought him there. We've forgotten about them by this point. We're just thinking, gosh.
They're the friends of the paralytic.
Friends, like
cousins, neighbors.
We're just thinking, gosh, this is, a real sort of Christological moment of Jesus, you know, he received the Spirit and he has God's power. And that's what we've, you know, when we were in undergrad, you know, reading the Gospels, that's what we were told this meant. And it's fascinating, sort of reading Candida, and she's saying, well, no, actually, let's flip this on its head a little bit and think about if a slave had written this, is it perhaps not Jesus sort of saying to slave masters, you know, let your slaves go, just get up and take your own mat, which is a really interesting interpretation of it.
Yeah, so it is important to point out to our listeners that what she says is the 4 people who are carrying the bed are slaves.
Yes, absolutely.
And the paralytic who is being carried is an enslaver, as she likes to say, or slave master.
Yeah.
And they are basically digging through the roof, lowering the bed, and by the fact that it was must have been a fairly sturdy bed, she deduces that the guy was rich, maybe, to be carried around. And as you say,
almost on a kind of litter, isn't it?
Yeah. Which of course makes a lot of sense if you had some sort of disability and you didn't have wheelchairs in those days, you'll have your slaves carry you around.
Yeah.
So she makes then the interesting point, as you said, when Jesus tells the guy, pick up your bed and walk. She's telling him, don't use your slaves anymore for that. Mm-hmm. Now, that is a very interesting way of looking at it, one which I had never considered before.
No, it's...
And one which I instinctively quite like. Mm-hmm. Is this what the text actually says?
Well, yes, or... Is this a reader response approach?
Yes, exactly. Is it the intention of the text to convey an anti-slave message there? Because the 4 people are not called slaves; they are just not identified. They are just left. It's left open.
Yeah, but is that because they were slaves? Therefore, they weren't deemed to be needing to be named.
But the guy who is writing it is a slave, so he is one of theirs.
That's true.
Although you might say, being a slave, you are you learn to be subversive and to fly under the radar, and you don't say everything openly. So you can play it both ways, I guess. But my sense is here what we have is as much a reader response, reading into the text of a message that we find.
Yeah. I think she's trying to very much find sort of social commentary in this. She's looking at it through the lens of sort of slavehood, servitude, whatever, and reading the text in light of that.
Yes, and it says a lot about her method. I guess we'll have to come to that towards the end of the podcast about is it a reader response or not? But it does illustrate quite nicely that she is doing a lot of very good historical work, but it is not the old type of objective historical criticism where you're trying to objectively reconstruct the past. It is very ideologically committed.
Yes, yeah.
She wants to see those people who have not been seen there before. So
Candida also... she thinks about the text beyond the author and it being written, and how it was received and read in society as a whole. And she suggests that slaves had a hand in the continuation of the story. So Mark's Gospel, particularly the ending, she had a really interesting suggestion for.
That's right, yes. And it kind of ties in quite nicely with our discussion at the Easter episode.
Yes,
with Mark's ending. So she has this story. It's obviously a made-up story. She's imagined it. It's a possible scenario of how the ending was produced. So originally, as you argued and Jeremy during that episode, so Mark ended with chapter 16, verse 8.
Yeah.
And the last sentence was for because they were afraid.
Yeah.
And in Greek, you have gar, because, as the last word. And the slave who was preparing to read the Gospel of Mark at a dinner party organized by his master for his friends.
Yeah.
The slave is called Felix, and he's preparing to read the Gospel to make a good performance. And he comes to this end, and the very last word that he reads is the word gar, for.
And he thinks, bother, what next?
They'll be throwing chicken drumsticks at me.
Exactly.
So this slave is a little bit afraid about the reception he's going to get. And I know, is he afraid he might get a good Christian beating out of a drunken, unsatisfied audience? So that's his dilemma. And he decides, well, let me kind of improve that.
Yeah.
So, I mean, what would you do? Let's see. You're the
improvise, right? Just
and you have some of the other gospels. You have other stories. So you have an appearance of Jesus to kind of make for the anticlimactic last verse. So Felix does that. He reads and then he gives his contribution. And there is another slave, Rodion. Who has been brought by somebody else, and he's taking notes. And so Rodion hears this new story. He thinks, oh, that's quite nice. So he jots it down. And that's how the new ending, the longer ending of the Gospel of Mark comes into being. Mm-hmm. It's a fascinating story.
Yeah. A fictional one, I suspect. I think Candida makes some very good points, but I think this one's just taking it a little too far.
A little bit too far, yes. It's when you're writing a paper or an essay and you want to show your breadth of knowledge and say, well, there are several different explanations for this, and then the third one, Felix and Rodion made it up during a dinner party.
Yeah. I'm not sure it quite cuts it.
But it is a good example of her overall method, where she takes her imagination and the evidence, and he combines them to produce something which may have been this way.
Seems perhaps plausible, but yes. I'm slightly more reticent to go with this one, I have to say.
More plausible in some cases than others.
Yeah.
So what is your overall impression then of the book? I mean, we started with the question, did slaves write the New Testament? Did God use ghostwriters?
Yeah.
What have we learned?
I mean, I think it's, as I say, a beautifully written book, and it really brings to the fore all the enslaved people that there were in early Christianity, and does highlight the role that they will have played in the production of texts. I think, for me, I'm not sure to what extent these secretaries, these scribes, actually did contribute to these written texts that were dictated to them. I think I'd push back a little bit on that, but no, I think it's a really important book.
Yeah, I would agree with you. It's really enjoyable. It is well written. It's very informative, and it helps, I think, on a broader scale, helps you to understand a little bit what slavery would have felt like, what writing looked like back in those days, and also and looking at some of those texts to appreciate some of the realities that we often neglect simply because we are not familiar with the enslaved experience. But as you say, I also think she probably claims a little bit more than she can actually prove.
Yeah.
Because her examples show some of the minor ways in which a slave could have contributed to the text. It's clear that we can't really know of all the other ways, and it is possible that what she suggests is the case, but it is ultimately a reminder of how limited our knowledge is of the past, and of the uncertain nature of a lot of those proposals. It is interesting, going back to our discussion about when you read the text, what you're looking for.
Yes.
So when I was looking at this work, which is a historical approach to the text, I kind of expected to find a more traditional, you're looking at the author and the intention of the author. And in a way, she is doing that. But she seems to be going a little bit further. Towards the end of the book, she's saying the reader is the author. And those slaves who were reading the text were actually the author because they interpreted the text and they presented the text to their audience. And some good points. So, for example, when Jesus is dying on the cross and the centurion says, this man was the Son of God, she makes, I think, the brilliant point that this could have been a statement of faith, or it could have been an ironic comment.
On behalf of
the centurion.
Right.
And so if you imagine the slave reading the text, or the lecturer, whoever is presenting the text to an audience, the way that they read the text will determine the interpretation. So you can end up with some congregation thinking, praise the Lord, the centurion has become a Christian. And you can have other congregations thinking, gosh, we knew it, Romans, terrible people. So in a way, the reader is the author, but I wonder whether she pushes that a little bit too far as well. At least for your liking, because I know you're not a great fan of reader response criticism, are you?
Yeah, I mean, I think, as I say, it's a valuable approach to take for interpreting the biblical texts, but I do think she's used this lens, and that's allowed her to find these very sort of small details, which without reading through the lens, we just wouldn't have found. And I think in doing that, she's then pushed those interpretively beyond what we can actually know. So I think, as I say, I'm a little reticent on that, the content of the material. She's saying, oh, this is like slave material, this is slave material, but because she's coming at it with this lens rather than it being the intention of the original author.
Yeah, you find what you're looking for.
Yeah.
And on the other, yes, I agree. And on the other hand, she challenges us to read ethically and to recognize the contribution of people whom we haven't realized were involved in the process. And they probably were, as we discussed, with Paul and the letters and maybe even the Gospels. In what way and how, we don't know. But they were.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think it's about nuancing it. Yes, there were enslaved workers and they were important, but I think it can be taken a little bit too far.
So overall, a great book, though. And we've done a lot of unpaid work for Candida Moss, haven't we?
No, I mean, it really is. It is a really good book.
I hope she buys us dinner sometime. And a lot to learn from. So,
absolutely.
It's been good talking to you about it.
Yeah, no, it's been really good. I've really enjoyed doing a book review.
Yeah, we should do more of this in the future.
Yeah, well, thank you very much.
Well, thank you as well.
We're going to take a break now over the summer, come up with some new exciting ideas, and we will be back with you in the autumn.
Absolutely, yes. Till then.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed our podcast, please subscribe and watch out for future episodes.
If you're interested in theology, why not visit the St. Padarn's Institute website and check out our programs.